wherever you're calling from in the world. We're really excited to have you here today. And just for those of you who heard that song, I want to talk about that before I launch into it. That was written by one of our committee members and one of our refugee MIT React Normal learners singing, telling the story of her, it's a storytelling of her life. So it sounds very special to us. My name is Lorraine Charles. I'm the Executive Director of NAML and one of the co-hosts of the Migration Summit. Welcome. We're really happy to have you here today. The Migration Summit 2023, organized by MIT Refugee Action Hub, NAML Gurram Foundation, is a month-long global convening designed to build bridges between diverse communities of displaced learners, universities, companies, social enterprises, policymakers, employers, and governments around key challenges and opportunities for refugee and migrant communities. This year, we're exploring the theme of co-creating pathways for learning, livelihood, and dignity through virtual events hosted by partners all around the world. I'm really happy today to introduce Drew Edwards, the Chief Executive Officer of Pangea Education Development. So Drew, over to you.
Amazing. Let me just take one moment to try to share my screen and pull up our deck here. I'm going to do my best to multitask, but I have to say it's always a little challenging during a presentation. So let me just pull this up and we will be set to start. Welcome everybody. As I was introduced, my name is Drew Edwards and welcome to our session, Silver Bullets and Sleeping Giants. Our session is based on the often known moniker of silver bullets and werewolves. Click through here. Today we're going to be walking through a couple different things. We have 4 key sections to where we're going to be presenting. One is sort of the background, which we want to start with the direction of educational technology, which feels fitting that we're doing this in collaboration with some appendage of MIT. And so we do want to talk about the opportunities, but also maybe some of the threats to that and how to ameliorate those. We're going to go into some of the context about where we're working. We have a project that we've been collaborating on between Avenues the World School and Pangea Educational Development, working together in a refugee camp in northern Uganda. We're going to go through some of our details and we're going to talk a little bit about sleeping giants. I won't tell you who those folks are quite yet. And then the hope is that we have a little bit of a discussion. I will say we are hesitant to lecture on anything that we've been doing, but we do want to share it because we think that there's some exciting findings and we're trying to explore more questions going forward. And we have as many questions as you might have. And so we'd love to know what questions or other examples that you might be able to share that might be similar. Our hope is that we can take away more questions that we can walk into and continue to think about for our work going forward. So without further ado, we want to start with a question. And the first one is, feel free to use the chat here. We're curious, who has made the greatest impact on your learning? And we're trying to think of stakeholders here. It could be a particular teacher. Sometimes we have these administrators that make an incredible difference in the school that we're in. We're using the word caretaker here. This could be parents, it could be grandparents. And then we have siblings, friends, and sometimes, a childhood arch nemesis. Sometimes positive and negative motivation can help us sort of achieve a push forward in education. So we'd love to hear a few responses just as a basis for jumping into our presentation. We've got some teachers who can become mentors. I think that's a great one. Who else has made the largest impact on your learning? We'd love to see just a few responses before we dive in. Okay, we have caretaker and parents, yeah. 4th grade teacher, manager current, amazing. Family, grandfather, fantastic. Oh, we have Mr. Myrie, great shout out. We love specifics. Friends and teachers, amazing. Well, feel free to keep sharing them in there. I'm gonna keep moving on. It's interesting because it's different, right? There are different folks throughout our lives. Some of them are amazing teachers who have transformed our education. Other times they are friends, as we've seen. Other times they are caretakers. And we're gonna talk about a little bit of what we're learning about in our context. So silver bullets and sleeping giants. And our big question is here, how might our hopes about technology or educational technology become a reality? Our session, as I was mentioning before, is based on the often known moniker of silver bullets and werewolves. And that is sort of this idea going back to the 1800s, where we have these fears. There were werewolves at the time in Eastern Europe, I think. But sometimes there are the problems that we see and that we're faced today. Looking at issues in education, especially for refugee and migrant learners, despite more children being enrolled in school than ever before, learning is stagnated in many communities. This is becoming known as sort of learning poverty, a coined term by the World Bank just a few years ago. It's being defined as the ability or being unable to read or understand a simple text by age 10, despite being in school for quite some time at that point. Before the pandemic, 57% of children in low and middle income countries could not read or understand a simple story by the end of primary school. In sub-Saharan Africa, that rate was 86%. And for refugee and migrant learners, it's even higher. One silver bullet the world is increasingly focused on is educational technology. And that's what we're going to be talking about a little bit today. Now, educational technology is soaring. We put a few stats here on the screen. One of them is that one hopeful thing, actually, and one of the reasons it's soaring is that adults own or share a smartphone globally, make up 80% of the world. I mean, that's absolutely incredible. One of the things that blew my mind when we started really researching a lot of the work that we're doing is that investment in educational technology has increased 40-fold. According to a McKinsey study that came out last year. And just last year alone, $28.1 billion were invested in educational technology. I think we're seeing a lot of promise, a lot of opportunity with it. Now, one of the things I would ask everybody is, have you heard the term AI or artificial intelligence? Not this year, but like this week. I think we're only on Thursday, right? I see a couple nods. I mean, in a couple of reactions here, it's something that's become almost ubiquitous with discussions or sort of headlines around the world. Another specific term could be ChatGPT, kind of the same idea. And so, with that, educational technology is utilizing artificial intelligence for really powerful tools that are being created. We're seeing adaptive feedback loops, and these are ideas that you could provide feedback based on student answers or behavior in educational apps that can give them feedback just like a teacher would. Amazingly powerful. Another one that we see very, 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 very often are personalized learning paths, which, I think we could probably simplify to say are sort of a scaffolded approach to introducing different concepts in sequence and kind of providing a pathway for learners to learn semi-autonomously, and I think the hope is fully autonomously. It was just a few years ago that Elon Musk helped fund the X Prize, whose challenge was to come up with educational technology that could teach children how to read without any human intervention. This was the challenge. There's a lot of hope and a lot of opportunity there. And so one of our observations that we've seen and which in more and more articles written about is that nearly all of these educational technologies are focused on individualized learning. Now, we stumbled into a finding that we think can lead to real learning because sometimes it does become a reality, other times it does not. And the observation is that there are giants among us. I'm going to tell you a really brief story, but one of it is that, I used to say for a long time, and our organization does all the time, that when a child becomes literate, her children will forever become literate too. And it's a beautiful notion. I think that it's true. I think most statistics agree with this. But it's also based on what I've come to realize is probably a faulty premise as well. And I don't think it's true anymore, that illiterate children themselves probably have illiterate parents. And as a result, there must be an intervening expert or savior that must come to ameliorate this challenge. One of our findings has been that those who are unable to read are not useless in the process of helping their children become literate. In fact, we have a belief that they're instrumental, especially with the aid of technology not being replaced by technology, and certainly teachers not being replaced by it either. We see it all the time, and we know that technology could either be an exacerbator of inequality, or it can be a bridge. And the answer lies not within the technology in itself, but in taking one more step to ensure that it's leveraged most effectively. What we've come to observe is that the family itself, regardless of prior literacy, something that we're calling education sleeping giants, could have the largest impact on outcomes with the assistance of this technology. So for us in this session, we're going to be talking about how inclusion isn't just about equity. It isn't just about virtues. It's also about outcomes. It has value. It has currency in our classrooms and in our learning. We'd be silly not to focus on inclusion as much as we're focusing on the educational technology itself. So this is going to lead to our premise. We're going to talk about rethinking silver bullets. Our thesis here, if you will, is that, and my colleagues are going to dive a lot more into the nitty-gritty of this, all of the details, is that although education technologies and applications abound to educate children in remote and hybrid settings, how we use these tools and who we use them with may be as important as what is on them. You know, we've discovered that one way that we believe we can bridge educational inequalities that particularly affect displaced communities is through marrying these two concepts. You know, it's not a particular technology or program, but a concept of inclusion that's counter to the world of experts that come to solve everyone's problem. So to kick this off, my colleague Brenda Apeta is going to tell you a little bit more about the program and getting into our findings.
Thank you, Drew. Hello, everybody. My name is Brenda Apeta. I'm the Director of Programs with Pangea. I'm really excited for us to be able to share with you the different things we've been learning with this program. If you are to reflect back on 2020 in March, what is the key thing that rings in your mind about that time? If you are to reflect on 2020 March, if people could just type in the box some of the things that pop immediately, the most thing that you remember in March 2020. Amy is shocked about how everything has changed. Yes, remote learning, definitely. So 2020 was a really complex time in our history as a country and as a world. For the first time in human history, we saw worldwide education in the classroom coming to a standstill. And for us in Uganda, we had to wait for 2 long years before children could actually access their right to education because schools were closed and children were not able to have their teachers support them. And during this crazy pandemic, this is the time that we started Project Backpack as an out-of-school program, which was meant to create opportunity for children to learn while they were in their homes. And this is in Mvepi refugee camp in Uganda. Uganda is home to one of the highest numbers of refugees. And so in one of the refugee camps, that is in Mvepi refugee camp, that is where we were having this project. And during this long dry spell without school, the tablets that the children were having were the only window to learning for children living in the camp. During the lockdown, Project Backpack was the only educational service that was active in the Mvepi refugee camp at the time. And this for us was a program that was community-led. We looked at parents and guardians that were really excited for an opportunity for their children to have something that they were actively doing at a time where there was no one that was supporting them learn. And most of this program really thrived on the parents' curiosity, because the parents then came to us and were like, how are we able to understand that our children are actually learning how to read? We saw parents and guardians coming to us and saying, I want to take the test. I want to know where I am. How am I actually doing in terms of my progress in reading? So there's a whole enthusiasm and interest that the parents were having in desiring to see their children learn, and them also be part of it. Because from the parents that we work with, whose children are in the program, you find that either they're illiterate or majority of them have a very low literacy level. With that in mind, we wanted then to have different, how doesn't this program work? We had children and guardians having access to offline educational apps that supported their literacy skills. So on these apps, the tablets, the children would then have access to these tablets that were rotated every fortnight within families that are in close proximity. Initially, this was mainly to have parents and families take responsibility of the tablets that they were assigned to, so that the either wouldn't damage them. But later on, we noticed that having this group, activities that they were doing were actually fundamental in the way that the children learned. So when the children were given the apps and they would do different activities, then we would have continuous assessments that were conducted using the early grade reading assessments, which tested the children's progress in their letter knowledge, in their phonemic awareness, their reading fluency, their comprehension, and thereafter, the learning guides who were supporting the learners would provide a roadmap. And this roadmap would guide the children on areas that they needed more practice on and to help improve the learning, the literacy skills. So the card we're looking at now is a card that we developed for the parents and the guardians to support, to let them see areas that could guide them. Remember, we said that the majority of them are either literate or low literacy. So the pictures were a way that could show them that these are areas that they could work with. And even for children who are learning the language for the first time, we could use pictures to illustrate to them the areas that they could go to in case they were struggling, let's say, with their lesser knowledge, and they could go and tap and practice more on those areas so that it would enable them to improve. And for us, this was just an interesting experiment for us to see how we could support the parents as they're supporting the children learn. Now, when we try to control one factor, and that factor being the family and the neighborhood, we noticed that there was a very big impact in the way that our children were learning. There was something that was happening within those communities that they were having, and we could see a lot of progress in the way that the children were grasping either whether it's letter knowledge or the ability to sound out words, because they were working together as a group. And so I'll call on my colleague Praharsha, so it gives more detail into some of the things that we were seeing and learning from the group learnings that were happening.
So as Brenda mentioned, I'll talk a little bit about the specifics of how we saw students learning and some of the data we got of how effective our programming was. And what we found, considering the time period of it being during the pandemic and having basically no educational programming otherwise, we thought that our this project backpack was tremendously successful in this time. About 55% of our students became functionally literate in the 6-month program. Again, this is considering that there's no teachers even, they're all just using iPads, and there's no other education going on. So global pandemics, we've thought, is a really tremendous number. And this is even 16 times the literacy attainment rate of formal schooling in Uganda. And so stepping back a bit in the specific reading skills that we want to develop in our students, our educational programming goes sequentially. So we start with letter skills, so sounding out different letters, and making how they sound and distinguishing between them. And then we move on to forming words together and reading chains of words. So your word fluency rate and how effectively you're able to read. And then as the final step in the process, we help students with phonics. So being able to find a new word they don't know and sound it out and understand it and keep on moving the passage. And so what we found is that almost all of our students cleared the first pass. So 88% of students were able to master the word skills, their letter skills. About 55% of our students were able to read at 60 words per minute. And while we struggled with phonics, that was considered generally the most advanced part of the program and was the most difficult task to teach. And so with this in mind, with how effective we'd been in this first iteration of Project Backpack, and looking to the future, we were really interested, as Brenda mentioned, in the community learning aspect, because we were looking at groups of kids with iPads and groups of families with iPads were really motivated to learn on their own. So in the this next stage of the research, what we're looking at is the relationships of the students relative to each other. So we're curious who the students say their closest friends are, what sort of activities they say to do with their friends, how often they're doing homework with their friends, how often parents or other family members are either helping them with their reading or encouraging them to read. And we're trying to use this data. We're asking the students this in our data collection. We're making notes of it. And we want to use this data to see if there's correlations between how social a student is in the learning and how much they lean into their community for the learning, and how successful they are in actually learning and attaining literacy. So how often a student may learn, maybe do their homework with their friends, with how well they do in the program, for example. And so with all of this in mind, with these next steps of the program and where we're coming from, the success we've had so far, at this point, we wanted to pose a question for you all. As I mentioned, we have some methods for sort of documenting how a community learns, but we're really curious how you guys think that we can further try to analyze and research and learn about how we can get a network of people learning together and how we can learn more about them. Yeah, essentially. So yeah, feel free to put that in the chat, raise your hand, and speak up in the in the Zoom room right now. Whatever method you all would like.
And I will say, this is always risky at any type of conference, right? There's the piece of no one really wants to speak up, but we think that this would be more helpful to us, and we hope that we could just turn this into a discussion together. So feel free, if you'd like to turn on your camera, we'd love to see you. We'd love to chat with you. Even if you don't want to say anything, it makes it feel more like a round table. But if not, feel free to kind of share in the chat and answer part of Praharsha's question, or any other ideas or reactions that you have.
I actually have a question, and sorry if this has been already mentioned throughout the presentation. Well, first of all, congratulations. I think, the project is amazing, and especially considering the challenging moment when you started the project, and also the populations that you're working with. And so, yeah, just shout out to the team. I actually was wondering in which, I guess, learners are learning in their native language, right? Like, how was that experience? I guess the team was there locally, or I don't know. Sorry if this was already mentioned, but yeah.
Yeah, it's a really great question. I'll jump in, and anyone that wants to compliment it, feel free to. Part of that is always a battle. Like, I think there's a lot of research that supports that learning in your local language is very, very important, especially before you learn another language when you're learning to read. We found that the community that we worked with had no interest in that. So I think part of that is that, as Brenda had mentioned, the community-led nature of all of this is really important. And this did not even start as a literacy intervention. It started as just some project-based learning that turned into families sort of desiring to focus on reading when schools were closed for, as Brenda said, 2 years. A really, really, really long time. And so the focus and the currency of the language of English was a big, big, big motivator. And so that's what folks were learning in. That's what the educational apps were in. You'll notice that's what the cards were written in. And that's also what the assessments were sort of assessing for. And I think an important note for our context is that folks that we work with from South Sudan, the entire South Sudanese curriculum at home is in English. As a new country, it had not been translated to local languages yet. So I do think that was also, it sort of makes a lot of sense, but it's also the operating and national language in Uganda that folks were, where they were living. So I would say that, Brenda, Praharsha, I don't know if you would add anything else to that.
Probably just to add on what you've said is there is the curiosity and interest that children and the parents had in terms of learning English as their second language. And so the activities that were on the app was one to support them, help them learn that, because even in the schools that was a language that they were also learning. So that was mainly why there was a lot of interest and that the parents had towards having learning the English language. Yes.
Yeah, thank you, Brenda. And Lorraine, you have your hand up. Did you want to jump in?
Yeah, so just adding to that, what language did the parents speak to the children in? Did they speak English or the local language?
The local language.
It's Bari, yeah.
Yeah, no, thank you so much. And I know, you're planning to have the conversation around other topics. But yeah, I think it's super important, considering that, because sometimes when you're developing programs and you're just like going in English with React, we experience that, in terms of people saying like, but we don't speak English, like you're leaving people behind just because you're using English. And sometimes it's a pathway that can take you somewhere else, but yeah, it's super interesting that as like with a young age and probably, if you experience they're starting to be literate in English. So yeah, that's awesome. Thank you.
Thank you. And we would love to open this. Any other thoughts or sort of questions that you have when you're looking and hearing about this sort of social learning that's happening in the homes?
I guess I have another question. What about the parents who were illiterate? Did you find that by the children learning to read, that also helped the parents learn to read?
Yeah, absolutely. And so actually what was sort of interesting is that Brenda had mentioned this a little bit and Praharsha dug a little deeper, that for the effects, it's basically that if someone became literate in a family, the whole family became literate. If somebody did not, it's pretty good chances that almost everybody in the family did not become literate. And so they were large group effects that were happening. And I think that's pretty interesting, and one of the things that we thought was even more interesting, dare I say, this is my bias, but when you control for who the families were rotating their tablets with, their neighbors, there was also an effect there. And I think that's fascinating, just trying to understand the type of social interactions or sort of the networks that are going on for learning. And any photo that you see or video that you see of some of the work while it was happening, you will see a dozen kids around the tablet at the same time. And I think, that gets back to that larger educational premise that, we're not trying to it's not simply conjecture, right? But so many of these tablets are meant to focus on the individual and assuming that there's one face sitting behind that screen. And what we're finding, unsurprisingly, is that folks love to share it. I think sometimes instead of having your big brother take something away, if you sit down and play together, or your big sister, everyone has a chance to sort of share and sort of manage that. And so I think that's sort of what we were seeing. I don't know, does that sort of answer that question a little bit? Great. I did see a question in the chat. It says, so how much time do they have to spend on learning every day? I think that's a really good question. Brenda, do you want to answer this one?
Joe, I think one, probably you back it up with some statistics, because we're looking at how much time also the children were spending using the apps. But we saw them using the apps a lot, because remember, this was during the COVID time, and so they had a lot of time to be able to spend it with the tablets as they were learning more. So I think, Drew, if you have the exact numbers of how much time they were spending on that tablet, it could help.
Yeah. So
it was.
Go ahead.
If I remember correctly, it was about like an hour 20 a day on tablets. So students were really, really motivated, and as Brenda was mentioning, with the lockdown, maybe the kids really want to learn how to read.
Yeah.
And I think it's also fair to add the context that although school wasn't going on, it's not that people didn't have things to do. In a lot of places, anybody who is in the focus of sort of displacement and refugee livelihoods, food rations were cut by 30% globally across all UNHCR sites. We saw in our particular setting, folks The government made land available for folks, but they had to go do their own farming to help supplement that amount of food. And kids were used during that period, not used, I mean, they were invited by their family and needed by their family to help contribute there. And so if you consider, the fact that folks are still prioritizing this, their parents are still prioritizing this, and evidenced by it and the outcomes, they were even participating with their kids, whether that was a form of entertainment or a form of enjoyment. I think there's something unique that was happening there that I think was really, really, really exciting in that amount of time. And there's a couple other questions here. And I'm going to jump into them. It's always hard to manage so many of them. Do you know if these effects also happen to other subjects like math or possibly programming? We do, in that we don't have an answer to that. And so I think one of the pieces for that, it was a very, very focused intervention. And one of the steps that we've taken going forward is to add additional applications to see what interests folks. I don't know that we're necessarily measuring for that. We have been so focused on literacy. But I think one of the hopes that we have is that engagement might drive further literacy learning, and that literacy learning can engage folks to pursue and learn whatever they want, right? And so, there's a lot of pieces. And I think Elizabeth just above that had a comment here, and just this idea of access to not only internet, right? Just to have access to things, but also access to information to get feedback. For us, everything that we were working on was offline because data is expensive, to be honest. It was just a very practical situation. And I think that's the case for a lot of folks. And so we were relying on those adaptive feedback loops to help support that learning, to be able to have a little bit of feedback from that based on whatever was on the tablet. So whatever was delivered, there was never sort of a connection after that. And we tracked app usage, and that was pretty consistent and true. There's another question here from Smita that was, how young were the kids that were targeted? Praharsha, you've been closest to the data recently. Do you want to speak a little bit about the demographics?
Mm-hmm. I think that in the latest phase, I think it's students ranging from around age 7, so primary 1, up to primary 7, so age 16. So it's a range of students, from like elementary school all the way into about the end of high school.
Yeah. And I know that we did have some kids that were 0 to 5 in the very first section of it. And that learning was a little bit different, whether that was because of sort of local language, we're not sure, or if that was, one of the big questions here, if not having a teacher in front of you is necessary, it might be more necessary as kids are gaining agency. I think anyone who knows a 3-year-old knows that. So I think there's pieces that we're still sort of exploring and trying to figure out.
I've got a question. How did this impact their learning when they actually went back to school? And did you track what happened to them beyond the project and what happened when they went to school? That
is the question of the hour, Lauren. So 2 things I think to consider there. The answer is yes and no. One of the things that we did track was 2 different comparison groups through partner data that folks shared with us. So some folks that were doing direct instruction and also folks that had nothing going on during that time. The folks that were not part of any program learned virtually nothing, less than 1% effect increase during that time. And I think that's important to note, because I've seen some data that said that kids automatically learned and advanced learning faster than before not being in school. I think that data is a little bit funky, because if that was the case, we should just never send our kids back to school, to the chagrin of every parent, sitting here, right? And so I think there's a piece there that we do believe that being part of some type of learning is really, really important. We haven't taken data since the kids have been back to school last year. We're about to launch another version of the project, and we will have a sense, even with some of the same kids, of where they're at now. I don't know how close of I don't know how close of a correlation we could draw to know that, I think, since then. But I think as those kids participate in the program again during that, and seeing how both as they've grown and as they're now in school, it's going to be really interesting to see Do kids spend less time on the tablets? I mean, they might just be busier too. I mean, that could be an enormous piece. The other piece could be that maybe that learning really complements, and we have an acceleration or sort of some rocket fuel for this. I think we're not exactly sure yet. But one thing to keep in mind with context, at least where we're working, and if anyone else is living or working in another context where this might be similar or different, we'd love to hear it. The average student to teacher ratio for kids that are in this program is 166 to 1. And that's an improvement from a few years ago where it was over 200 to 1. And so one of the questions we have, and dare I be a little abrasive here, is that school, worth doing? I think we have to ask these questions when you have so many kids in a space. There are social emotional benefits. There are, I think, just sort of benefits to routine and being part of something. But we have to keep asking these questions. It's not enough to put in your own kids in school. I know that if I was displaced, I would not be happy enough with the outcomes that we see in any of these schools. And I think we have to keep that in mind and try to empathize with parents and students in that community. And so one of the things I think we're wondering is there another way to possibly also do learning? Maybe it doesn't necessarily have to be school. And so I think we're exploring all of them, the complements, the things that are happening outside of it. And one thing that we're delineating this time is how many folks are going to school and how often. So there's part of a question that our team is asking to understand how frequently and what days kids are going to school so that we can try to characterize what that looks like, because the data that we've seen is suspicious. That's 99% of kids in the camp are in school. But when you walk around on a Tuesday, you see a lot of kids walking around. And so it makes us think maybe that's not the case. And we'd love to learn a little bit more about that. There's a great question here. How can we measure the long-term effects of this? And Clara said that was addressed a little bit. There was another one here that was, encouraging everyone to continue giving feedback and thoughts on the question. Oh, thanks, Camilla. That's great. Yeah, thank you for redirecting us. We tend to go down rabbit holes here, so this is perfect. But I guess that question, how might we further analyze this or document or learn more? And if anyone has any experience with peer-to-peer or sort of any type of peer learning, I think it'd be really interesting. Amy has a question here, which is there a means to add a peer learning component to the research? For example, a book or project that must be done together with neighbors or siblings. I am the least of an educator of the three of us, so I'm gonna maybe kick this to Brenda to ask what you think about that, Brenda.
Thank you, Amy, for the question. I think it would definitely be an interesting thing to see how what impact that would be having in terms of how the kids are learning. And for us, it's trying to discover different means what the data is telling us, because I think we're at a space of we want to understand more, and with the project growing, it gives us opportunity to do that, for us to try out different aspects that could enable us to see what are the aspects that are there that are encouraging the kids to learn. And these could be things that we could see if these are things that could be replicated by, within education programs or in different communities that we are working with. I think it's a good idea. I will definitely look back and see how we can be able to incorporate something like that in the program. Yeah.
I think one experiment that we did do with that small one, just to complement this, Amy, as you know, books are near and dear to our hearts. And so shameless plug, we are a local language publisher and we love local language. We love books. We love reading. One of the things, a project that we had folks do before this was have kids ask their parents stories, or their grandparents or their caretaker, whoever that is, stories, often folklore, and record those as one of the projects that we did just to facilitate interaction between folks and see what was going on there. And we got stories back. Some of them were incomplete, but there, I think it also proves that maybe the interaction was happening. And I think it would be very curious to know a little bit more. I think we could redesign that, but it just wasn't really our focus at the time. And so I just say that to say, I think there's curiosity there. I think there's interaction happening there. And I wonder what components of family life we could try to hijack's not the right word, but try to engage to try to see if we can facilitate more engagement. Smita has another question, which is, did you ever look at rural education models successfully implemented in similar landscapes like, say, India? We haven't, and I would invite you, if you wanted to hop on and share more about these, we would love to just learn about them. I'm not that familiar with that. And you are muted. I don't know if I can unmute you. Let me see. And also, if you don't want to, that's okay. That's not a problem. I don't know if anyone else either has experience with any of these other rural education models. Okay, well, Smita, we'll wait for a text description if you have time, or if there's any links or anything that we could point to. I know we would love to learn about that. Sort of this idea, sort of access and further away, maybe similar to Sugata Mitra's model. That's a great point. Certainly, if anyone's familiar with Sugata Mitra's work, this idea of sort of the school in the cloud, or the granny cloud, was a program that they launched under Newcastle University, but they did this throughout different sections of India with the very first TED grant, or TED prize. It was $1 million. And so they used this, and they had community sort of led schools in India, and they were learning centers where students could come, almost like a learning studio. Our partner Avenues has an education model like this that emerged during, conveniently or related to COVID, I'm not sure, but like a studio type of learning where students can learn in a hybrid mode, right? So they're doing project-based learning, and then they can come into the classroom to collaborate with peers with the help of, I guess, a teacher, but really more of a facilitator in that process. I think that's a really, really interesting model, because in many ways that's sort of what's happening in the home, I think, through our model. Yeah, I think that's quite interesting. All right. Well,
and actually something that me and Lorraine were just discussing, and maybe Lorraine, you can jump in for this. I think today morning we had a session with Amala that they also work with young populations. I think they especially work with high school learners. And so, I mean, the summit is really about that, trying to make those connections and collaborate with each other. And so I'm looking for their website and even connections, for you both to connect about the work that you do, because I think and at some point it's kind of similar too. There we go. Thanks, Lorraine.
Well, that's great. Thank you so much. I'm going to bookmark that. I have another question, if that's okay. And it's a question for you. Is anybody here a parent? If you could raise your hand, your virtual hand, physical hand. Or does anyone have like a nephew or a niece? I'm trying to get as many of you as possible. And let me ask you this question. I guess, what prohibits you from being more involved? So not involved, but more involved in your kids' educations. Like anything that you would want to put in the chat, or if you want to come off mute, what factors, I guess, just prohibit you? Because a lot of the question that we're trying to understand is how to continue to engage and include more parents in the process. I mean, it could be anything. I'm not going to say any examples because I don't want to leave you, but I'll list them in a little bit.
Maybe I'll share first. I've got an interesting example. My kids were French educated, and my French is un peu. So I can, I see Matthew smiling. My French, I can understand, but I could possibly speak if I want to, but I choose not to speak. And the French system is really, I'm sure Matthew can, really rote learning, really rigid. Primary was nice. The early years was great, but when they got to secondary, it got really punitive. And I got so frustrated that I really disengaged from the school. I mean, I really disengaged because I was so upset. And every time I tried to tell them this is not the way my children learn, they were like, no, this is the way we do it. I'm like, but this is an international school. You got kids from all over the world. My kids are French, but they're also English. But they were very, very punitive in how they did it. So we moved countries because I hated the system.
Sure.
We're now in Scotland, not in England. And the school is lots of sport, very sport oriented. And I'm much more engaged because they are supporting my child in a way that I know he's happy.
Right.
And for me, if the school doesn't listen to me, I'm just not interested in engaging with them.
Well, that's really interesting because there's a power dynamic that exists in a lot of schools, especially if you don't speak that language, and that may be the case here. It sounds like just not speaking the same language or not having maybe familiarity with all of the content. I think a lot of parents relate to that. How many times have you said, I know that I've learned this, but I don't remember it right now. Like, I think a lot of us feel that, but a lot of us also don't talk about the power dynamic that exists at schools, especially if you didn't do well. There's this certain amount of discomfort with going to schools. I witnessed it all the time, both in the one almost year that I managed as a teacher, didn't even make it a full year. But there were pieces where like some folks were uncomfortable coming to school to even talk. And sometimes the discussion is around school fees. It's not even around their kids, around how well they're doing, or it's instructions to parents. There's this, I am here and I can teach your children. Maybe you can, or maybe you can't. And so there's a lot going on there. There's a social dynamic. There's maybe content knowledge. Is there anything else that folks would add to that? Ooh, I see Clara had a comment here as well. I mean, especially if you're a teacher, Clara, there's this question around like, should you be everyone's teacher in your family? I'm guessing. Is there sort of some of that? Yeah.
But I think that does happen because, like, when you asked about, I thought it was a great question, Drew, by the way. I see it like in my family, for example, my sister. I don't have children myself, but my sister does. And my parents, when they try to get involved, my sister just immediately just shuts down and just does not allow them to make any comment on my niece's education. But if I come in and like, if I talk to her, then she'll listen to me, but only because she respects me as a teacher. So I think there's, yes, a power dynamic here. And also I'm an older sister, so maybe that helps also. But I think it makes a big difference on the trust that the family has on your ability to educate their children, right? And I think I see that my sister, when she listens to other people that she doesn't agree with them or the lifestyle or anything, she would just immediately dismiss anything that they would say in terms of education. Yeah. And for me, I think I think she respects me as a person and she values me as a professional. That's why she listens to me, right?
Interesting. And I mean, that's an interesting point, even just how we think about education, right? How much of us are exploring with our kids versus having to teach them, right? Even the notion of teaching is a one-way dynamic instead of an exchange sometimes, which, and so I do wonder what that looks like. And Scott added something that I think complements that a little bit here, which is about values. I don't know if anyone saw this in the news the last 10 years, but several countries around East Africa are reducing the number of hours that kids are in school, which is really interesting, right? And the argument that was, I at least know from our context in Uganda that was in Parliament, was that parents also have things to teach kids, and they want more time with their kids. It doesn't just need to be rote memorization, concept and skills sort of learning that needs to happen. Scott here talks about values. How do we have enough time? And are those values ever counter to what we're learning in school? Curriculum is ostensibly political. We will not always agree with everything that's in there, but in a world in which book bans are increasingly common, what role do parents have to say what their kids are learning or when they're not or what they're not learning throughout that time? And so, I mean, that is an interesting point as well. Like, are any of these things at odds with what folks are learning or kids are learning? And is there an exchange? Do you get to choose, especially if it's not a school that you can unenroll your kid from? How much do you really get to influence what is taught and what's not? Samantha says, when I was teaching, I heard a lot from parents because certain methods and approaches have evolved over the years. Parents were not understanding how to support them when these new approaches. This is an interesting example because I think you're probably talking about Common Core state standards, in which we talked about that we have to teach, for instance, long division 2 different ways or 3 different ways. And I think we've all felt that way when you say, your child might be teaching or explaining something to you and you go, yeah, that sounds right. Because you don't know how to jump in. You don't want to be able to engage. And there might even be a humility kind of side there. So I think there's something really, really interesting. Elizabeth has one more comment. I'm going to read it out to folks, but it says, as an aunt, not in the same location as nieces or nephews. And when we do connect on the phone, I want to spend time connecting with them about how they are doing rather than spending our precious time doing schoolwork. It's into a whole topic about homework as well. I'm trusting that they're getting educational support from their parents, from their teachers. And so you're intimidated to teach them something wrong because methods may have changed, or maybe something's just different, right? The long division example, I think, was a good example. I would even beg the question though, could we open the discussion about what learning is? Does it have to be about homework? Does it have to be about education alone? I think we all have something, not only that we could teach kids and that kids could teach us, but how many of us right now are learning just by hearing other people talking about this? And that's one of the reasons we wanted to just have a discussion, is we are not the panacea of like community learning. I think we've just found that it seems to be pretty important, and we just want to talk to more folks that have an interest in it. Lorraine, I think you have your hand up.
Yeah, sorry. I just want to say, you said I wanted to jump on from what you said about education isn't about the math and the English and the science. It's about everything else. And for me, my son's an amazing athlete. School, he'll pass, but only by being pushed, not from lack of ability, but lack of effort, because he's more interested in sport. And I think we are so obsessed with the sort of grades and the sort of what we call as traditional success, that we fail to value that kids have other talents. Okay, yeah, he'll probably go to university, he'll pass, but he's never going to be an academic, but he'll be an amazing athlete. And I feel that we have to really understand that school isn't only about nurturing, or, I'm good at science, or I'm good at English, Spanish. It's nurturing the person as a whole and really focusing on their talents. And really, at the end of the day, I'm more concerned that he's happy than what his grades are like.
Well, and that's an interesting point, because I would even ask, what incentives are we creating for kids to behave, to learn, to achieve, to focus on other sides of things, right? Like I often tell folks, this is embarrassing, but I've never won anything, and so I only won awards in athletics for being a good teammate. And I swear to God, in every single sport I've ever been a part of. And I used to my dad used to make fun of me for this because there was never anything that said first place. But as I've gotten older, the more I've realized that my dad is wrong. That this idea of maybe character and team building is actually quite important to the folks that we work with, the folks that we interact with on a daily basis. And I think what's also maybe hard, I don't know if anyone would agree with this, I think that as adults, we're uncomfortable with the things that we can't measure. In a world of big data, there's the assumption that we can measure everything. And when we really get down to it, there are so many intervening variables. I don't know if anyone ever, in a economics class, everything held constant. The problem is that it never is. And so there are so many things going on that it is difficult to attribute, to know exactly what and why something's happening. And research gives us a little bit of a lens to be able to poke into this. And that's what we're noticing. But I think folks in this project, and Praharsha, Brenda, I'd invite you to share more here if you feel strongly about it. But I feel like we're in the place where we can say, we know that something's happening, but we don't know why. And Praharsha, maybe you could speak to this a little bit. And we're trying to ask those questions right now, right? You've been really kind of poking and prodding at what else can we just try to learn about what's happening here? And to what degree do we even have the ability to? Does that sound right?
Yeah, that sounds a lot of what we're doing at this stage is trying to get a lot of information from our students of so tell us more about what your life is like. One of our questions is, what are the activities that you spend most of your time doing? So a lot of the answers are stuff like collecting firewood, doing chores with my mother or my father. So we're trying to get this I think the word is holistic sense of this person and understanding how that affects them in this one specialized thing of learning and becoming more literate.
That's right. And so I think those are really great examples of just what are the limitations? What can we learn? Oh, go ahead. Jump on in.
No, I love that comment. And I remember a session I attended a couple of days ago here at the Migration Summit. And we were talking about storytelling, and the power of storytelling and someone who is constantly, writing stories. She was like, I just sit down with, kids or even, young adults, folks. And I'm like, what did you want to do when you were a kid? What did you want to do when you were going to be an adult? And sometimes people are just why are you asking that? It's no, because we're trying to think as a person holistically, not thinking, going through specifics about, the journey that they're going through, right now. And so I think it's very interesting to have that approach, you know, when we were talking about teaching and learning as a whole, you know.
Right. No, it's a really brilliant point, because you're right, that bigger picture. I think it's hard because everyone defines the whole scope of learning differently, even in the same school district community classroom. And at some point somebody has to put an order to these things, right? And so, but is that order law, you know, law and order there? You know, I think Amy had an interesting question. It's a different question too, which is like, you know, how does play factor into learning in a displaced community? Anyone else want to answer that? It's a hot topic, especially, and I will say there's not a ton of research on it. I know that there's a lot of funding pushing towards there, especially by the LEGO Foundation. I know vested interest there, but there is this open question around what role play can and should look like in learning. I'll open it to anybody, but any thoughts on that, especially in the displaced setting?
I'll talk. I can maybe talk from my experience with React learners, and just, you know, I'm mindful of time, but giving background. So we have students that are between ages 18 to 35, and so it's young adults. And you know, we teach programming and in Python and computational thinking, and most courses are around that. And sometimes just for the sake of community building and just, you know, getting to know each other, we would just, like, you know, host social events and talk about, you know, whatever. And then, like, when we were doing program feedback, like after 1 year of, you know, packed agendas every day, it was like, what was your favorite, you know, event? What was, and they were all like about social events, you know, and just like playing games, and, you know, and just like learning from each other and listening to stories. And, you know, it was surprising to, and, you know, it was very good, but, you know, they were all, you know, this wanting to be engineers, but actually their favorite thing was this whole other thing, when we were like just playing games and doing, you know, our thing, you know. And so that was really interesting.
Well,
especially because we were all adults, you know.
Yeah, no, I mean, trust me, I still love to play, right? I mean, there's so many, we all feel that. I'd love to go to summer camp again, right? Like there's a lot. I mean, I do think, just to bring that into context too, every single refugee camp I've been into in every country I've been in has an ECD center. And those early childhood development centers nearly always are from children 0 to 5 or 6 before primary education. And they're nearly always play-based. And I think that's actually quite good. You know, and to be honest with you, I'm not part of the world of elite early childhood development necessarily. And I think sometimes the big focus is, we're going to have your kid reading before they're in kindergarten. Sometimes that's the case. Sometimes it's mixed with play. I'd probably say this though. I notice a shift, and Brenda, you'll probably have a perspective on this as well with our work. When you shift to formal schooling though, I don't think that that's been my observation, at least anecdotally, that that's the case. And there was a student that we interviewed named Mandela Joseph. He was at the end of the program, and he was a particularly high achiever in it. And we were asking him just about the program to say, like, you know, did you like it? I mean, what did you not like about it? We were just trying to understand a little bit more. It was just a month ago. And his response was that he so enjoyed playing the games on the tablet, that it was just like relieving. You know, there's a lot of things going on. I can tell you the deficit there. There's a lot of things. His dad passed away within the last year. A lot of things had gone on. So he becomes sort of the man of the household. And all he had to talk about was just that the games were great. And the funny thing is that I don't consider any of the games on there, or any of the educational apps, games. And so, I mean, I think there is something to say that some of the technology is doing such a good job to engage kids, both pedagogically, in a pedagogically sound way, but then also in, how do you call it? In a way that's fun and engaging and play-based. And so I think we can see the impact on engagement at the very least. And I think in our situation, there's probably a big correlation with outcomes too. And so, I mean, I think there is something really positive there. I guess, Brenda, would you affirm that? Do you have similar sort of experiences with just formal learning in displaced settings?
Yeah, and probably it's also a kind of a culture in the Ugandan education sector, in the sense that it's more of kids are studying to pass exams and less of play incorporated. So there's really been a push for more play in the way that children learn, and looking at the, Drew says the apps are non-play related, but the child in me gets excited too, just using the apps that the kids are using. So there's a lot of play-related activities in it that then gets the kids very active and glued onto the tablets to learn more. And in the process, as they're learning, they're actually doing it through play. And for us also, just because we do run a center where kids come and just read, and creating activities that then have kids come to the center to delve deep into reading and have fun reading is something that we are being mindful of, that kids can actually play while they are having a chance to just read. So it's something we do push for a lot in the programs that we do. So, yeah.
Well, I think Elizabeth has a note that she had sent that kind of complements that, right? And kind of notes that in Norway, there's no homework for students as the focus is to encourage play. And the comment kind of goes on to talk about like this idea of curiosity leading to deeper understanding. And I would actually even note in Norway, because we were speaking about sports quite a bit there with Lorraine, there's supposedly also no scoring until you're in middle school, right? So the idea is just to enjoy playing the sport. I have friends and I have kids that I coach where you could never tell them not to count in their head with what's going on. But I think that idea of like no travel sports, no scoring, this idea of focusing on play and curiosity. I'd even challenge everybody. I have a nephew that when he was 6 was describing all of the different leaves from trees and which tree that they were from. And I had no idea what he was talking about. And I have fancy degrees and all types of life and working experience. And one of the things I had just noticed was like, this person's exploring and learning so much more. And it's not just about catching up with the skills that you or I have. It's about them exploring the world in a way that's unique to them and what's around them. And isn't that the essence of education? Isn't that what we're hoping for with and from everybody? Smith has another comment here. Anything play-related visual learning trips, as part of study, they have an enormous impact. I completely agree, not just on engagement, but probably on learning as well. Lorraine's son would not have agreed with no scoring. So with you as well. I have a hard time. Actually, as an adult, I just never remember the score. So that served me well on the competition piece. We are at the end of our time and towards the end of our time here. And I do want to just say, are there any other comments or sort of questions that anyone wants to leave us with just on this discussion today, or any parting wisdom that you could offer to our team as we're trying to continue learning a little bit more about these topics? We do want to open the floor once more before we close things out.
I just want to add one thing. When you spoke earlier about the quality of education the displaced children have, for me, this has been a bone of contention that I see to UNHCR all the time, because they're obsessed with, maybe UNICEF as well, I'm putting you on the spot, Matthew, because they're obsessed with refugees integrated into the host community education. But if we know the host community education is failing, why are we doing this? So we get really upset with that, okay, because they're brown and poor, we can just give them whatever nonsense education that there is. Yeah. But why can't we do something better?
I mean, that's the question too, right? Because research in general can be where we're testing and trying to understand and use data to drive outcomes, or it can be we're testing on kids who don't have a choice. The power and the agency that's, you often see new and crazy ideas like, what if we only taught a kid with a tablet? It's like us. I mean, it might not work in a lot of other places. One, because there are laws that protect from things like that, and two, because parents might not stand for it. And I think that's totally fair. I mean, the only thing I would push back to say is I think there's a fine line, right? I mean, what's the balance between innovation, trying something new, and also trying to build or reinstate something that does work in some places. There's a really great documentary. I can't remember the name of it. And if anyone does, please put it in the chat. But there's a documentary, I think, taught about teaching the world. And it's questioning the assumption that Western education is premised off of, that children need to be gathered in one place in order to learn, and that curriculum should be imparted on the rest of the world. I mean, I think UNESCO is released a paper last year called Towards an Indigenous Curricula. And one of the pieces that it advocates for is, instead of internationalized education where we're globalizing and we're systematizing and we're replicating the same education for all, why don't we leverage and focus on what every culture and every tradition and every indigenous area has to contribute to education in that place and in that space? And I think those are all valid questions. I mean, I would say, Lorraine, you and I are probably aligned, because we're just asking the question, is it worth putting that many kids in a classroom when we clearly just don't have the resources, or we don't care to see or sort of measure those outcomes? I think it's a really hard piece.
Yeah, and then when they come out of the other end, unable to get a job, like, oh my God, what are we going to do with these young people who can't find jobs? Well, because we failed them in education, how can they then find jobs?
Right. If you have an education problem, you have a human resource problem, after that, right? And those two things translate. Fiorella, you had an interesting comment here. I don't know if you wanted to speak to this a little bit, but it sounds like a wonderful, wonderful project.
Well, actually, it's part of my final project for my degree in university. I'm also a volunteer with Camila for an NGO that rescues wildlife animals and tries to rehabilitate them and reinsert them in wildlife. And specifically, the project is about educating kids and in general, the age of like from 8 to 10, and try to go to schools and explain like the importance of environmental awareness, empathy with the native animals. And well, I'm trying to create like the project to like let them know what the species are, more interactive learning with the kids and the NGO. So if any of you has like any kind of experience with this, I'm really open to hearing like different perspectives of how this can be included on classrooms.
Yeah, I mean, it's a really great question. And I know he's not on anymore. Dr. Charles Xavier was on before, who studies neurobiology. And one of the things that he focuses on, what are different parts of the brain that I believe focus and like elicit engagement. And so I would be really curious, because I think we could probably, that's not to like over academic that, I guess, but to say, I'd be so curious to know, what role play or engagement could have to develop things. I mean, amazing, important characteristics like empathy, right? I mean, I think that's just so interesting.
Okay, really look forward to get in contact and send more info about the project. I'm actually like in the first and second steps of like investigation, trying to like apply some models on real life, hopefully someday in the next future.
That's great.
So I'll get in contact with you.
Yeah, that'd be great. Well, and Camilla actually just shared, for anyone that wants to be part of just continuing a discussion on this, it looks like there's a LinkedIn group from the Migration Summit, but also we could continue probably sub-threads on things like this and be able to share. And I think, to be honest, like, we would love to I what you learn. I think it would be so informative for what everyone else is trying to learn.
Well, thank you.
Amazing. You'll see a couple other links here, just joining folks. There are actually sessions throughout the month. And now that we're done with ours, we'll have more time and less stress. So I know I'm going to look forward to sort of engaging and jumping on others, but we do encourage other folks to, access prior recordings, but also to jump in and be part of the rest of the summit. Yeah.
So thank you. This is a really fantastic session. As we went over, Cami and I were like, this is just so amazing. Thank you, audience, for the great engagement. Thank you for being here, and please join us in the rest of the summit. We have amazing sessions coming up. This is only week 1. We've got 3 more weeks of this, and tomorrow we've got a reflection session. Lana and I are sort of, engaging with whoever joins to sort of reflect on what we learned, and it's an opportunity to sort of get to know each other in a sort of less structured format. So we welcome you. It's on the link. So Thank you very much, Drew. Thank you, Praharsha, and thank you, Brenda. It was a great session. Have a really lovely evening, lovely day, and thank you, everyone.
Thank you, everyone, who came. Thanks for having us.
Thank you.
Bye.
Thank you. Bye.